Welcome to Seminole Sidelines. Happy Thursday. Hope you're having a great week. We have a big day. Thursday, the first day of Florida State's football practice. Preseason camp is here. Congratulations. We made it through the summer. So we are looking forward to seeing the Seminoles on the practice field later this afternoon. We've got probably a dozen or more stories, videos from all the interviews with Florida State's assistant coaches. Yesterday, Curt's got some takeaways from those interviews. We've got things that we're looking forward to watch, position battles. We will have a full podcast reflecting on day one of Florida State's camp. Look for that around 8 p.m. tonight on the Osceola's YouTube channel. Of course, you can catch us on demand on Apple, Spotify, however you digest your podcast or watch us on YouTube. We appreciate it. Our channel is growing. But for now, Florida State's Board of Trustees meeting on Wednesday, it was not as electric as the one back in February, but I think there were some similarities in the tone, in the frustration, in the message, and it was delivered, I thought, very much authoritatively by President Richard McCullough. Jerry Kutz, we welcome in our publisher from the Osceola, Curt Weiler, senior writer at the Osceola. I'm Bob Ferrante. Jerry, you've been in on a lot of these meetings through the years for Florida State athletics, for the boosters, for the future of the university. This is a big one. This was a big step. I thought what Dr. McCullough said was very, again, authoritative. Let's focus there to start. What did you think of what Dr. McCullough said and also how he said it?
Well, I think the first thing is, I think it's important to note that this is a procedural step. What I wrote in my column is that the president has a responsibility to report to the Board of Trustees on important issues before making any decisions. And so I thought this meeting was sort of a procedural step. And he laid it out for them, what has been happening now for more than a year. And he was very clear that they've worked hard to find a solution to stay within the conference, but there doesn't appear to be a solution. And, we can talk about that more. But to me, Bob, that was what this meeting was about, was the president fulfilling his obligation to the board to make a report on which he sought their opinion, and what they gave him was unanimous support for the problem, the case that he built, and the frustration that unless something dramatic changes with the conference coming back to them, accepting a dramatic change in the distribution of revenue, that FSU will be forced to leave.
Bob, you're muted.
You think I'd figure this stuff out by now after all these years with
I'm
COVID?
glad it was you.
I haven't done that in forever. Okay. Kurt, you were watching from home.
I do it almost every week.
Yeah, I got that one.
I couldn't focus on my football story. It was so engaging. Hearing them talk about buying planes and some other going over a legislative budget. Then we got to the fun stuff.
Kurt, you were watching it, and I think a few people were commenting on our board on Twitter. We got some texts. This didn't feel like the fireworks that a lot of people were expecting. But I thought that Richard McCullough said what he said and asking for radical change. This wasn't a coach. This wasn't an AD. This was very forceful from the president.
Yeah, it's Richard McCullough kind of got thrown into the deep end of this, coming to Florida State to be the president from Harvard, where you're not like academics and athletics. The balance is a little different there, but I thought he's handled it pretty well. I mean, that's he I thought spoke. Of course, he spoke elegantly and all that, but I thought, he's well versed on the importance of this for not just the athletic side, but the university side, and how kind of this will benefit everybody. And yeah, it's different. I agree. It's one thing for Michael Alford to say similar things as he did in February. It's funny, Michael Alford didn't talk much yesterday. He kind of had said a lot of the things, and I feel like let a lot of other people do the talking for him this time. But for a university president, I mean, how many national media members there were on there watching? I mean, commenting on the absurdity of a university president kind of pointing out, hey, this is what has to happen. I mean, it's a truly unique situation that, I mean, I don't cover the stuff widely, especially in terms of other schools and all, but I can't imagine there are many instances of a president speaking so definitively about a school's conference or a school's future and what conference they fit into. It was pretty wild to watch unfold. And obviously, he wasn't alone in those thoughts by any means. It seemed to be some unity.
I thought the most maybe passionate argument after Dr. McCullough was a really good choice. Let's be honest, this felt very choreographed, similar to that February Board of Trustees meeting. But when you're looking for the right BOT member to speak out, hey, Drew Weatherford's a pretty good one, quarterback at Florida State from 2004 to 2008. And he talked a lot about, hey, this isn't a $30 million argument. This is $400 million potentially over 13 years. Drew hasn't really spoken all that much at Board of Trustees meetings. Here and there, he's picked his spots. This was a pretty good spot and almost 1,000 words of really, I thought, good commentary, Jerry, about just how you view this as an athlete, how you view this, how you need to view this as a Florida State athletic department. And really that if you want to play games, you can play games. But if you want to truly compete against your rivals down the road in every direction, you need more revenue to make that happen.
Yeah, that quote was later reiterated by Board of Trustee Chairman Peter Collins, and that's that we don't want to play, we want to compete. And I thought that's really the essence of it. And what Drew went on to say is that it doesn't appear that there's the revenue potential in the ACC to accomplish that we can't compete without this revenue model changing. So, I thought Drew kind of was like the wingman to support the case that the president had just made. And I agree, Bob. I thought it was almost each trustee kind of emphasized a bullet point in the McCullough case building.
Well, I think we heard from various Board of Trustees members, and again, you tend to hear some of the same voices meeting to meeting. I thought we heard, like you said, a variety. There were a few more who piped up. To some extent, I think they all wanted to say something of significance, knowing that this was a significant meeting. One of the ones that I thought was pretty succinct is the math does not compute. I think that was from George Gonzalez. Maybe to Curt first, were there any other BOT comments that you heard that backed up McCullough's argument or just kind of showed that everybody's unified here? This was a unanimous motion here going forward.
Yeah, there were definitely a few. I pointed to, I tweeted a few. I'm kind of going back through my tweets. I think Justin Roth, I thought a fitting phrase was the death by 1,000 cuts is kind of what staying in the ACC as things currently are would be for Florida State, where it's not going to kill you today. It's not going to kill you tomorrow. But if by 2030 you're stuck in the ACC still and at a larger deficit than you are now, is it almost like too late to catch up where you're behind? And can you ever catch up to kind of those programs in the Big Two conferences? Frankly, who knows what the state of the NCAA looks like, 7 years from now in 2030? Yeah, it's interesting. So you talked about the Weatherford quote of what was it? Is it do we want to play games or we want to compete? Did that strike to y'all? I went and found the quote because I remember it struck me as kind of almost being a counterpoint to something Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner, said last week at ACC kickoff during his address. He said one of the presidents said it best. Are we chasing a dollar amount or are we chasing success? And it felt like a counter to that because truthfully, whatever Jim Phillips can say in that moment, those are the same thing. I think we all think, and everybody seems to think, in terms of being successful in the future of college football, It's going to come down to that dollar amount. So those go hand in hand. It's not what are we chasing? It's you got to chase one. You've got to chase the dollar amounts to get the success.
Yeah, let's maybe unpack that a little bit, Jerry. I think Florida State has gone about being competitive in every sport very well. It starts with who you hire, from a head coach, assistant coaches, then your facilities, your fundraising from the boosters, your fan support, whether you are a sport that's not charging admission to a sport like football, men's basketball, women's basketball, where you're really seeing fan support. I think Florida State has built that foundation overall to be successul. The question, I think, to the Phillips point, to the potentially Weatherford counter, is yeah, you are competitive in a lot of these sports right now: soccer, softball, all the major men's sports. But at some point down the road, and then you could argue if it's now, you could argue if it's coming in a few years, the money is going to get the steps that the SEC and the Big Ten will take will further separate from this ACC grant of rights that is through 2036. We're going to see the SEC have another TV deal in addition to its new one. The Big Ten's TV deal goes through 2030. So again, the ACC will still have 6 more years in this older deal. Jerry, to the point of being competitive, I think Florida State's put itself in a really good position. But just how can the lack of money coming in, whether it's ticket revenue, booster revenue, how can that impact maybe these Olympic sports? We heard the Olympic sports being mentioned by a lot of the trustees on Wednesday too. How can that impact those sports?
So that was the thing I was going to add about what various trustees said. And that was several of them did make the point that this isn't just about football, it's about all the sports. And particularly our successful women's teams will really be harmed by this. I mean, those are the sports that are going to harm the most. And the reason I say that is I honestly believe Florida State could remain competitive in football, but it would be to the detriment of all the other sports. You know, you always have to feed the cash cow. And our football budget right now, and let me back up a second and say, we're competitive right now because the SEC schools haven't started to realize the $30 million difference. You know, the budgets right now, the contracts are relatively close, television revenue wise. It's with the new contract that's coming, that the difference will be $30 million. And at that point, you know, I would see Alford continuing to invest as much as he has to in football and try to find it somewhere else in his budget. And that would be very harmful to all sports other than football.
The trickle down would lessen for sure, because the truth is, I mean, you have to be competitive in football. Like you said, that's the cash cow. But I mean, how would it affect? I mean, if you're having to commit a larger percentage of your budget to football, well, that $30 million difference may be what trickles down, or some of that is what trickles down to the softball programs in the SEC Big Ten, the soccer programs in the SEC and Big Ten, the women's basketball, even baseball. I mean, all of those sports. You're seeing, I think, like having a number of SEC programs recently announced like new baseball stadiums or serious renovations, not going to be able to happen on a serious level as long as there's that difference. That can't be where your smaller piece of the pie, if you're Florida State, goes. It has to go to football to keep you competitive. So yeah, I mean, it's 100% true. And I think a few people did bring up the trickle down effect and their concerns of that too. I think Drew did, but I think a few other people did as well.
Yeah, there's a sentence by President McCullough that says that this would create major problems for the university in terms of Title IX. And I'm paraphrasing them, but you know, you you're forced to, through Title IX, to spend relatively equally between your men's and women's sports, and provide equal opportunities. And that would be tough if you're spending a lot more on football. To balance that equation in women's athletics would be to the detriment of all other men's sports. As they've said, when you really start to break it down into those elements, it's an impossible situation.
Well, and another part of it too, this is actually transitions to what you just put up there, Bob. A big question that lies ahead. We don't know what the future holds in terms of, obviously, the NCAA has been pretty adamant about athletes aren't employees. But that doesn't mean that someone else, that Congress, whoever else, can't swoop in and say, yeah, you don't get to decide that and make that choice for them. And that complicates things severely. And I mean, if that were to ever happen, and to some degree, even if it were just like football, basketball, the revenue sports, that makes a big difference in terms of the revenue distribution and the revenue difference as well.
I think we've got, yes, in addition to that, we've got the other big questions of how do you get around a grant of rights, which yet again, we haven't seen. We know that Florida State flies General Counsel Carolyn Egan, as well as maybe other people, up to Greensboro and maybe now Charlotte to take a look at the document. It does not leave because of open records requests. You don't want media requesting to see what's in a contract between the ACC, the ESPN, and the member schools. We don't know truly how you get around the grant of rights that goes through 2036. That's a big question moving forward. I think the other big questions are potentially the 42 million times 3 is I believe, the financial buyout to just get out of the ACC, let alone how do you broadcast your games moving forward, because those games belong to the ACC and ESPN. How do you fundraise $120 million? I guess that's a campaign for potentially the boosters. Or Jerry, do you have thoughts there on how does that money?
I think I would imagine from my reporting that what they would do is they would borrow that money and pay it out of, they'd use the revenues from the expanded new conference contract to fund that buyout. Is how I would see that. Of course, if you had a capital campaign and said to people, hey, if you contribute to this, we can leave the ACC, you would have about 100% participation, I think.
That fundraising campaign may go even better than one to get rid of a recent football coach.
Exactly.
And that one went pretty well too.
Yeah.
Well, it's it is interesting. I know Peter Collins, the chairman of the chairman of the board of trustees, has talked pretty candidly about, like, we have a good understanding about the grant of rights. I think he said as much in a live stream earlier this week on another website. That's fine, but does that mean that you think you have a way out of it? Here's the thing. People wanted them on that live stream yesterday to say, here's how we're getting out. Here's the loophole we found. They're not going to announce that publicly. If this happens, whether before August 15th or after August 15th, it's just going to happen, and we'll find out about it after it happens. We'll get a notice from FSU or a notice from the ACC. We're not going to see the inner workings of this. That's not something that they're going to share publicly whatsoever, because, just think about how the Texas, Oklahoma, and the UCLA, USC things happen. This one's different, obviously. Those TV deals were ending sooner, so they could happen. It was easier to make it happen. You didn't kind of have to make the public cry, kind of sow chaos like Florida State is trying to do a bit right now in the ACC. But when and if the thing actually happens, and I think Drew Weatherford said it's when and how, not if at this point, was kind of his wording. We're not going to know when it's happening. We're going to know when it's done.
Yeah, let me raise two questions. One is, could the negotiation be? When they signed the grant of rights to 2036, and I don't know that FSU ever signed it. To be candid, we don't know that. But when that grant of rights was put together for that long a period of time, it was done so to keep the members in the conference. But now it's tending to do the opposite, right? If that grant of rights was 3 years, I think Florida State could live with it. But when it's 13 years, it's untenable. Could the negotiation be that they want to see the grant of rights period reduced?
Yeah, that grant of rights I know was done not that long after the wake of Maryland leaving the conference. And Maryland kind of got out easily. That's why I know the exit fee, the buyout has gone up to it. It wasn't as big. Maryland didn't pay 3 times their TV revenue. I don't know exactly how much Maryland paid to get out, but I know that it was kind of in the wake of that. And it was also, I think, a bargaining chip with ESPN to finally get the ACC network. And so, yeah, that's a question. I mean, what the question becomes, I think, too, is do they shorten the grant of rights? Is there a amount of money? It would be a large amount of money because, truthfully, I think if they left now, I've seen estimations. I think David Hale even this morning put out it'd be about $500 million you would probably have to pay between the buyout and your media rights, but acquiring those from ESPN for every year through 2036. Could they talk down to a lesser number? It would still be a huge number, but could they, like you talked about borrowing to make that happen? I mean, could they acquire their rights that way and kind of buy out at not the full price, but like a large amount? The ACC is not motivated to do that, but maybe ESPN's desperate to keep Florida State, not let them go to the other networks in the Big Ten and want to keep them in the SEC.
You know, Curt, it's a good question, but sometimes the math just doesn't work. You know, if you're borrowing, I saw some proposal on the internet the other day that it's $300 million and that FSU would take $10 million a year. Well, by the time you start doing all that, you just might as well stay in the ACC. You know, the net is a wash. And so, you know, I don't know. These are good questions. And I'm certain that the Florida State Board of Trustees, there's a bunch of successful businessmen in that group of trustees. They've done this math, and they've, in their due diligence this past year, I think they have answers to those questions. Now, let me say this. I mean, you guys are reporters, journalists. There's a leap of faith here that we have to take with Collins and with the Board of Trustees. When they say they have a handle on the grant of rights, we've got to accept that. Otherwise, the conversation is over. I mean, you know, this has been my dilemma. How do I cover this and with interest when there's this belief that the grant of rights is more impenetrable than a medieval chastity belt, you know? I mean, if it is impenetrable, then why are we even talking about this? So it forces us to, in order to have the conversation, to trust that what we're being told, that the FSU has a handle on the grant of rights, is in fact true.
If they had found a true loophole, we would know by now. You know, Florida State would have exploited it. They'd probably be out of the grant of rights. I think what it comes down to is, I mean, was that meeting, and really even Alfred in February, knowing they're kind of stuck for the time being, a power play to try and force the ACC's hand to get a bigger piece of the pie, to beyond the success initiatives go straight to a uneven revenue share, like Texas has had in the Big 12, like USC and UCLA had in the Pac-12 years ago, like you wrote about last week, Jerry.
Right.
Or it always felt like, in a way, it was going to come down to, is a school willing to test this in a court of law? And I think Bob Sasser on the board, trustee Bob Sasser, yesterday mentioned maybe it's time to go to the courts or something to that effect. It was the first time I'd heard one of them say it in as many words, that like, if you do not have a way out, but if you have a good grasp of it and think that it won't hold up, it will not be cheap, but in the long run, it would save you money if you think you can get out of it to take it to a court of law and to kind of say, ESPN, do you really want to get involved in a lawsuit and a court case with one of the schools in one of the conference you represent?
I think the other question I might throw out is the ESPN. ESPN is becoming very choosy about what it broadcasts, how much it pays, where it feels the value is. They are laying off employees because of the cord cutting, because many of us are going to streaming. The other question is, does ESPN want to be in the business of broadcasting ACC games for the next 13 years? And you could argue they have to by contract, but what happens when ESPN comes to the table and says, we may not want to pay this money to every school that's currently in the conference, and says, hey, we have to be a little bit more choosy. And I'm not going nuclear here, but what happens when they say we don't want to pay school X that amount of money? We like Florida State, we like Clemson, we like Carolina, it's got a lot of fans, but ESPN could control part of this conversation. I don't think they're going to talk about this openly currently or down the road, but it's just their choosiness has made me think about just how much of a priority the ACC broadcasting is among their portfolio of pro sports and college sports programming.
They probably would have taken the Pac-12 TV deal. Not that a few years ago, they probably would have gotten a pretty good deal on the Pac-12 TV deal. The fact that they're not interested, the fact that they're letting that go to, reportedly looks like it's going to be Apple if the Pac-12 even still exists, which we don't need to get into that. But it speaks to, how that's changing. And maybe they see, you look at that chart and that I know Michael Alford shared back in February, and when Florida State was the only ACC school that averages, I think, over 3 million viewers a game. And that's during, the worst extended stretch in modern Florida State football history. And meanwhile, how many schools were below 2 million? We're at half or less of what Florida State gets in terms of average viewership. I know a lot of ACC media folks were taking the opportunity yesterday to kind of dunk on Florida State about, well, why are you doing this coming off of the stretch you've had? Like, Florida State is whatever record over the last how many years, but of course they're doing this. It isn't about wins and losses. It is in the scheme of things, but it's really about eyeballs. That is what the networks care about. And even through the bad times, the Florida State eyeballs have been there far more than everyone else.
Yeah, I think it was on the chart I saw, Clemson and Florida State were the two above 3 million. And then it dropped all the way to 2 million.
Yeah. And Miami was third, but Miami was solidly third. I'll pull it up.
Yeah. And then Duke was last with a little over 1 million viewers. So there is a have and have nots there. Bob, Kurt, you're looking for that. I was going to bring up this, and I haven't heard anybody yet bring this up, but there's no question that ESPN is having difficulty financially, and the Mouses as well, And so, we've seen ESPN start to cut, as you mentioned, a lot of their personnel and their content as they adapt to revenues. At what point do you think it's possible that the SEC isn't expanding? As Slive said, they're on hold. Because if the SEC were to take on a team right now, by contract, they have to pay a full share, which is $80 million per year per team, right? So if they brought in two teams, that's $160 million per year ESPN has to pay. Can they generate that revenue in advertising dollars? Or or will even the SEC be affected? Are they being affected by ESPN's financial troubles? So there are so many questions we don't know. And that's the point that, Chairman Collins made to me one day, is that this thing has so many tentacles that most of us fans and reporters, we try to look for one thing, like the old movie City Slickers, remember? We're all looking for the one thing. But this thing is an octopus. I mean, is ESPN going to be strong enough? If you had the option, would you want to go Big Ten? Because it appears Fox and NBC are stronger as a media partner. There's just a lot of questions. And you have to, this board of trustees, this is one of the more challenging issues in athletics a board of trustees has had to deal with.
Curt, go ahead. You were going to say something, or do you have those numbers on the viewership?
So I do have the numbers. I found the chart. So this is 2014 to 2022, which again is the tail end of a good Florida State run, but really from 15 through 21 is a really rough stretch. I mean, it's the roughest stretch in modern Florida State football history. Florida State's at 3.17 million, ahead of Clemson at 3.08 million. And mind you, that's Clemson's best stretch in modern history. Miami is next, a full million lower at 2.04. Then Louisville at 2.02. There are, let's see, 8 programs that average 1.7 million or less. I mean, there was a lot of talk, ironically enough, from Wake Forest yesterday, because Wake's had a great run recently. Wake's had probably its best run in modern history under Dave Clawson. Wake is second to last at 1.26 million. So, I mean, that is why Florida State's doing this. They're talking about the competitiveness and being competitive. And yes, that opens themselves up to all the jokes from the rest of the ACC over like, maybe you should worry about winning the ACC before you worry about doing more, winning the national championship, trying to win the SEC or the Big Ten. Yeah, it's I don't know. I get why people lean towards what you were just talking about, Jerry. I get why people lean towards the SEC. Florida State geographically makes sense in the SEC, given we're kind of doing away with the geographic nature. I mean, I don't think either of us would be surprised if in the next decade you kind of have the two major conferences that are both kind of across the entire country. But it obviously couldn't be the SEC anymore. But I don't know. I mean, the Big Ten is in line to actually have a better TV deal under this new arrangement with, who is it? It's split CBS, Fox, and NBC, right? They kind of got all three they're all doing one game a Saturday, I think. And a point that actually was brought up of why the Big Ten might be interested in Florida State, they're doing night games now. The Big Ten historically doesn't do a ton of night games, especially in November as it gets real cold in a lot of those places. Guess who would love to host a bunch of November night games?
Yeah.
Where the weather would be pretty nice compared to in Columbus, Ohio, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in East Lansing, in Penn State College. Florida State, Tallahassee's pretty nice in November. It's a little chilly, but not next to a lot of those places.
No. Well, okay. I think which conference FSU would be inclined to go to is a subject of a future podcast. And I thought the same thing when I was listening to that meeting. That meeting wasn't about talking about where FSU could be headed. It was one more procedural step to how do we get out.
Down that, though, I will say before we move on, I know a lot of people said, how does Florida State know they have a spot in one of the big two? They're not going to definitely have a spot. No conference is going to say, here's a spot for you until they get free, because no network, no conference wants to get involved in tampering or lawsuits or anything of that kind. So it all has to be behind the scenes, if it's happening at all, until we know for sure.
They'll let their coaches tamper, but they're not going to tamper.
Hey.
As I said to someone the other day, there is honor among thieves at times. Okay. So where are we now? Let's put this note in here real quick. The ACC, no comment on all this, no comment on the FSU Board of Trustees meetings. But if you hear that there is a meeting scheduled of the conference's presidents and chancellors, it's not a rushed meeting per se. They meet twice a month. They've met twice a month for about a year. Obviously, these success initiatives was a popular topic when we were in Amelia Island in May. They quickly announced they've agreed to something. They have not announced what that something is now more than 2 months later. To me, that shows lack of consensus among the league's presidents in agreeing to, we know there are a few proposals on the table, specifics have not been shared publicly. So let's all get to this because this is our big conclusion. Let's just call it gut feelings. Jerry, by August 15th, Florida State will have to send a letter, some type of communication to the ACC if it intends to leave the conference by July 1 of 2024. If that deadline's missed, it could be then July 1 of 2025. It's just a deadline within the contract. What do you think happens in these next couple of weeks?
Well, what I wrote in my column that was just published on the Osceola is I think this meeting floated another proposal out there for the ACC members to come back to FSU and say, we're willing to accept a proposal to share television revenue on an uneven basis. And I think that if the members were to do that, make a good faith effort, it would hold Florida State and Clemson in the league. Short of that, I think FSU announces on by August 15th, that it's their intent to leave the league.
Curt, what do you think?
Yeah, it's I am skeptical that the ACC member organizations will do that because I think we've kind of learned from the prior times that conferences have committed to uneven revenue. It didn't keep those teams in the conference long term. It appeased them in the interim, but it's kind of, I could see those ACC teams saying, well, I bet they're going to leave anyways. So why do I want to make them better off now if they're just going to desert us anyways in the future? If they can make up the difference where Florida State, Clemson are happy, sure. But I mean, is North Carolina going to have a problem with that? Is Virginia? There are a few other, Miami. There are a few other coveted, I think, brands long-term in the ACC. Not 8, not enough to kind of dissolve the ACC. That's what that would take. But I think there are more than just Florida State, Clemson. I mean, they talked pretty candidly about it. It was pretty fascinating. I mean, this has been in the works for a year. We've heard, this has really been in the works for 18 months, but they talked to, one of the board members said kind of, we've been talking about this for a year. It'll be interesting to see if it happens by August. I'm skeptical because it seemed like there was some talk about maybe a year from now being a more realistic timeline. But if Florida State does have a grasp on the grant of rights, thinks it has found a way out or just that it won't hold up in a court of law, something to that effect, I think they could very well do it by August 15th because I think they would have a home somewhere else where they could make more money. I mean, the brand is the brand. That's what this all comes down to.
So we'll have an interesting 2 weeks ahead of us. Jerry, you want to wrap us up?
Well, I would just say I would agree with Curt that I think they've had a year to come to the table. The other ACC members, and I don't believe they will. So, I agree with Curt on that. Bob, what were you going to say there?
I think part of me wants to say it's a tough deadline to have at August 15th because you think, well, you've only got 2 weeks. But again, Florida State has gone down this road. They're a year, 18 months into it. It's not a 2-week thing. I'll be very curious what the conference presidents say or do at this next meeting, whatever it is. I don't see consensus among those presidents as to what to do. I don't see a Wake Forest saying we're going to give up money. I don't see a Boston College saying we're going to give up money. But Jerry, I think to your point that you've said is what happens to schools like that when there is no Florida State? What happens if Clemson is Florida State's wingman? What happens if Clemson is next? And again, we should say there's no Clemson Board of Trustees meeting scheduled on their site. So there's nothing at least imminent in the next few days. But I never felt like Florida State was the only school here thinking about a jump. I do think Clemson will very heavily consider its next step because Florida State has considered its next step just with what President McCullough said on Wednesday.
Well, now, obviously, Twitter rumors are what they are, but now I see a report on Twitter from somebody that there is movement from the ACC to see if ESPN would explore adding as many as 8 Pac-12 teams to the conference, kind of reuniting that alliance. So I don't think that's a long-term fix. Maybe it helps in the interim. I mean, I don't know. The problem is, are those schools picking the ACC right now over Big Ten or Big 12 invites? That's what that, even if that's real, that's what that comes down to.
See, we were joking about this, Kurt. I can't remember if we were in Charlotte or somewhere else, but remember that whole ACC, Big Ten, Pac-12 alliance email that came out maybe 2 years ago, and there was nothing ever tangible that came out of that agreement. Is there something crazy that some Pac-12 schools and some ACC schools might try to put together? But to the point of more revenue for the current ACC member schools, I don't see value added from a Pac-12 institution. I mean, we might argue what a California school would bring in terms of eyeballs in that state. If you co-brand an ACC network with a Pac-12 conceptual network, I mean, this is a crazy kind of Hail Mary scenario.
Would that reopen the grant of rights? Can you just add 8 schools and keep the same grant of rights? Like, if they did that, I wonder if it would almost be a concession of Florida State and Clemson are gone, but we need to add some more to try and remain somewhat relevant. You know, that's the who knows? Because I don't see how you can add 8 schools or 4 schools and just be like, but it's the same grant of rights.
Well, yeah. I mean, listen, this stuff it's so mercurial. I mean, right up until the time that it's executed, it can change. I was talking with Randy Shannon about that when he was at TCU. He was saying that there was we were about to have, I think, a formulation of leagues back then, a conference expansion that was going to include Pac-12 and other schools around the country. And it looked like it was going to go. And then over the course of one night, it fell completely apart. And Randy's point was, as a football coach, you don't want to even think about this kind of stuff, and on today of all days, we're talking about this. They open camp. It's their first day of football. And, we heard that mentioned by either Chairman Collins or the president yesterday, that he has not gotten one text from a coach asking about what's happening. They've been around this long enough to know anything can change at any given moment. I mean, you've got a desperate Pac-12. You've got, the ACC is not desperate. I mean, they're in third position right now in terms of revenue. They look relatively like a good landing place if you're not in the Big Ten or SEC. But who knows? I had another conversation on this sort of a topic with a person in the know, and they were posturing that a ACC kind of Pac-12 thing could work in that the viewership isn't great when Cal plays Stanford. But if Cal was playing Florida State and Stanford was playing Miami, you'd have
feels like one conference carrying another conference, if you ask me.
Yeah. And so I don't know, the Pac-12 has a lot of problems, not the least of which is what time kickoff is out there.
I mean, frankly, I know, we've been on the air. John Wilner, who's like one of the main experts for that conference out on the West Coast, said the Pac-12's future is going to be decided in the next 24 to 36 hours. That's what he said. I mean, because Oregon and Washington, I'm sure, have interest elsewhere. The Arizona schools have interest elsewhere. I think they're having another board meeting tonight. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, who knows what's about to happen? And when that happens, it changes a lot of things.
Yeah. So, I think to wrap this up today, stand by. We've got a date, circle it, August 15th. Something may happen as soon as that. And to Curt's point, Pac-12 movement could happen in the next 24 to 36 hours. And all of that shapes the future.
Yes, stay tuned. Obviously, stick to the Osceola.com. Full coverage of Florida State football camp. Again, they'll be on the practice field about 3:30 this afternoon. So we'll have photos, videos, stories. Again, look for a full live podcast video around 8 o'clock tonight. We'll go live in prime time to give you our early impressions on day one of football practice. And, of course, we'll have takeaways, observations written on the Osceola.com. So we thank you for watching. For Osceola publisher Jerry Kutz, senior writer Curt Weiler, I'm Bob Ferrante. Hope you have a great Thursday. Take care, and we will talk to you later tonight.